introduction. And thank you for all of you who are here today. And even though we don't see each other person to person, but you will hear me. And the main focus of my intention of being here is in order to a little bit add to your thinking caps, because I'm sure that each and every one of you has a good perspective about what was World War II about, what the Holocaust was about, and you are here because you do your work with the future generation, the students who they are the ones who will have the opportunity to do what they will be able to do wherever they are. And it's really a variable. And having seen some of the names of persons that had the opportunity to hear me speak, I hope that I will not bore you too much by adding just, because basically there are three important elements that I consider that I'd like to include in my presentation. The first one has to do with remembrance. What is it that we would like the students that will hear you about the years of World War II and about the Holocaust, what they will hear from you and what it is that you would like for them to remember. The second element that I would like for you to take from here and also to add to the thinking caps of the students that you will be speak to has to do with honoring. Who are those that deserve to be honored for what they have done during those years? And the third and probably the most important element that I would like for you to take with you and have with you has to do with reflecting. Reflections on the meaning of those days for our life and living and for the life and living of the students that you will have the pleasure of sharing your thoughts with. So, the important elements of remembrance has to do with the World War II years. And I am sure that most of you had the pleasure and also the opportunity to hear and to read about what the World War II years were about. And if those of you that will want to do a little bit more about hearing what I had to say, if you type in my name on the internet, I had the pleasure and the privilege of being at various sites in North Carolina, and in some of the sites, they have recorded my presentations and the recording are there. So the World War II years had to do with what Nazi Germany has done. And what I want for you to especially emphasize, the element that had to do with Germany being in the forefront, the 20th century, and obviously a lot in the 19th century, being in the forefront with all the good areas and the important areas, whether it is science, literature, art, and so on. If you look at any of the sources, Wikipedia or anywhere else, Germany is indicated to have been in the forefront. And for that, enlightened and developed, and most of the developed countries of Europe, to make it possible for a character with the name of Hitler to come into power and to not just do in order to provide the leadership for Germany to follow him and to do all the bad things that Germany has acquired during those years. But in addition to Germany itself, also to get allied countries, one after the other in Europe. First, obviously, Austria, then Italy, and then the Ukraine, and even Japan joined them, to the point that Japan was the country that came and offended the United States in what they were doing. So what I want you to have a sense for, that Nazi Germany has brought together the evil forces, that what they have done is they ended the lives, and what's most important element, ended the lives of 11 million persons. And among the 11 million persons, obviously 6 million members of my faith. I'm Jewish. And 6 million Jewish persons ended their lives at the various sites that they have chosen in order to end lives. Obviously, Auschwitz was one of the major sites, but in addition to Auschwitz and various other sites, at the extermination camps, at the concentration camps, they ended life with very, very much ease. So among the 6 million Jewish persons, 1.5 million children. Now, what I want for you to have a sense for, children, meaning 15 years or younger. And that's what they have done, to end the lives of children that did not have done anything that would have deserved for them to end life. No evil actions on their part. So that's what the claim to fame of Nazi Germany is about. And having been later on, when I was professor emeritus and I have written about the Holocaust and I've been invited to several sites, including universities in Germany. And what the reaction of the second generation, when I have spoken there, what their reaction was, in most instances, I am so ashamed of what the generation of my parents have done to this world. And they were not only saying that they were ashamed, but also some of them decided, I don't want to feel good about doing what I can do in this country. So some of them have come to Israel in order to get an education. And I will not name names about who have done. And what is important then for you to remember, that in Germany itself, even though they decided to give reparation and so on, to this day, if you'll have a chance to visit various sites, for the most part, it will be just a bad feeling and a shame. So the first thing then, what I knocked on your thinking caps, was having to do with what is it that I would like to share with the thinking of the students, that you have the opportunity to think about. That evil leaders can do a lot of harm, not just for their own country, but also for other countries and so on. So the first thing then that I try to share with you had to do with remembrance. The other thing that I want for you to take with you and to, again, knock on the thinking caps of the students that you will be working, that you are working with, have to do with honoring. Who deserves to be honored? Well, obviously, the first group that deserves that is World War II veterans. Obviously, I would not be here had it not been for the 3rd Cavalry and the associate units that were with them, that came and liberated me from the camp that I was at. So World War II veterans. But in addition to World War II veterans, if you have a chance to be at United States Holocaust Museum or in Israel at Yad Vashem, you will see the listings of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in the various sites of persons that did small things that they could do in order to save. Had it not been for those persons, more persons' life would have ended. So honor World War II veterans and also the right doers, those that have done right. And the third element, and I think that that's the most important in education. And as you know from my bio, that my own work experience over a good number of years, first in Israel and then here in the United States, I was a teacher. I started that, and as I will share with you in a little bit, I had very, very limited education to begin with. And I will then share with you a little bit about that, about my origins, about growing up. I was born in a small village, Transylvania, which was then under Romanian occupation. And the village life was very, very simple. When we had fruit to pick, I could climb a tree and have some fruit to eat. If I wanted to drink milk, I would go and milk a cow and drink milk and so on. Village life was very simple. We did not have in that village any store that you can go and buy anything. So in the season, we would have the fresh fruit and whatever. And when we would dry them for the winter months and so on. So that was my life for my first 10 years. When I was 10 years, well, actually, I should start that when I was 6 years, I had to attend the school at the village. And at that village, the teacher was so sophisticated, unlike you, that he knew how to teach us how to read and how to write. We have done that the first or second week of the classes. He knew also some math. He knew how to add and subtract. So the first or second week of my experience at that school, I have learned that. And I would take always books with me to read because that was in that village, that was the level of education. When I was 10 years old, my parents decided that we should go to a nearby city where I would get a better education. And that was year 1940. And because I was born in 1930 and not that long ago, I had my 91st birthday. So you have an idea that, you know, many, many years ago. Anyway, we moved to the city when I was 10 years old, and I was all excited that I'm going to go and attend the school. But that school that I was supposed to attend had such an evil character who was the principal that he would get about 500 Jewish students that were supposed to attend that school and would throw all kind of insults at us. And what he would do, beginning of the year, insult us, no, you get lost because Jews don't deserve to get an education. So that was the end of my education there. And we were there for 40 years from 1940 until 1944, because in 1940, what the Hungarian government decided that they joined the Nazis, and then they started doing to the Jewish persons all the things that they have get advice and counsel from Nazi Germany what to do. So that was the life for about 40 years that we were able to be on the streets for about 2 hours every day. And it would be either like from 8 to 10 or to 10 to 12, but that was about what we were allowed to be out. So for 40 years, from the age of 10 until 14, that's what my life was like. And the only thing that we could do is because we had a property in the city now. And so as a kid, I was able to go and do some yard work and grow some things for us to have there. And obviously I said we were allowed 2 hours to be out, so we could go and plant some or go to a store and buy something, but for 2 hours a day. Now imagine being able to be out of your home for 2 hours and for 22 hours in your home. Obviously, we are experiencing in a different way now with the coronavirus that we cannot be as freely around as we would like to be, and what it is like to be enclosed in your own residence for some time. So that was until 1944. And in 1944, first they have taken us to what was called ghetto. And I'm sure that you heard the term and you know what ghetto was about. That was to close in the Jewish persons in a site that they could be closed in, and not being able to go out or anywhere, but just to be there. And what you had there in terms of the site that belonged to you was what it is that you brought with you. And like if you think of and what I like to say when I'm speaking at one of your schools, if you think of your school site where I would be speaking, where there are about 100 some students there or 200 some students there, that in such a site there would be that number of persons. So we were enclosed there, and the only thing that I managed to do, I volunteered to do work. And to this day, in addition to reparations I'm getting for being in concentration camp, and also getting reparations for my work in the ghetto. And that was for about 3 months, and then one day cattle cars arrived, and that has taken us to Auschwitz. You heard the term Auschwitz. Auschwitz was the site where, according to various estimates, about 1.5 million persons' life ended. And that was not just Jewish, but also other persons that the Nazis decided to end their lives there. And what was there when we arrived, and I like to share that, was a beautiful night full of stars. And looking at the beautiful stars, it was just a tremendous feeling. But the stench, because they not only ended lives, but they also burned them. So the crematorium and the burning, you can smell it. So the next day, starting toward the selection, and one of the SS guard, and the reason that I'm here, because one of the SS guard, for whatever reason, volunteered and asked me in Russian, what was my age? And I responded to him, 14. And I remember the words that he used, "Не кажи никому." Don't tell anyone you are 14. Tell them you are 17. So in all the reparation document that I'm getting from Germany, I was born, because that's what I did. I was born 3 years earlier. Instead of telling them I was born 1930, I was born 1927. And given that I was then not 14, but 17 years old, I went with those that went to be sent to concentration camps. So from Auschwitz, where those that were 15 or younger, 50 or older, their life ended there, I was shipped to Mauthausen in Austria, and from Mauthausen to a place called Ebensee. And obviously the sites that I'm mentioning are mentioned in my speaking, other places that I have spoken, but also they are written up by visitors that have been there. So I was at Ebensee for about a year, and the first 6 months I worked in an underground tunnel. And in that underground tunnel, what we would do is, the Austrian had intentions of putting valuable things. So we had to do an underground site for them to be able to put whatever valuable things that they wanted to put in that site. So for 6 months, at the age of 14, I worked with others, obviously, where whatever their age was, but I did the work the best that I could with air hammers, with putting the rocks on the carts, pushing them out and so on, whatever work. So that was 6 months. Another 6 months, I worked in a site called Kiskrove Marian Guest House that was across the street from a great guest house, where we were producing construction material, sand and other construction material there. And once a week, I was selected to clean the barn of the owner of that guest house. So once a week, I would go in, but given that I was a prisoner, they could not trust me just to go in and do the work. They would set up a nice table for the SS guard. The doors would be open and I would do the work there. And the guest house owner had a daughter who was about my age, and she would set up the table for the SS guards, but then she would bring some dry food, either the bread with something, pasta, or whatever was the right that she could make. And she would make always the sign not to. Obviously, I mentioned to you the righteous persons. Once a week, I got additional nutrition. And obviously, when I had a chance, I went back in order to be thankful for that person that was a righteous person, that she has done what she has done. And given that I am getting close to half an hour, I'll just briefly mention that lucky for us, one day we have seen that cars were coming, and in that cars, obviously the unit that came was the 3rd Cavalry. And with the 3rd Cavalry, there were also alongside with them some assisting units, African Americans. So the door opened about a year in 6th of May, a year after I arrived at Ebensee. The doors opened and people started to walk out, and I was walking with them out. And that's the last thing that I remember about Ebensee. And as I was walking out, apparently I fell into a roadside ditch. And that's the last thing that I remember about Ebensee, other than having been there to visit years after. But what happened is that I fell into a roadside ditch, and the attached unit, African Americans, that they were not integrated, that they were just attached without their names being listed, that they were serving there. One of the attachment unit picked me up and drove me around until he found a place that the nurse there said to me, "Eine schwarze Soldat," which in German says, "one black soldier brought you here." So obviously, had it not been for that black soldier in the attached unit that picked me up from the roadside ditch and took me to what was like a hospital, where the treatment that they had, because medication was not available, take a cold shower in the morning, take a cold shower in the evening, and put me in bed and protect me there what they could. So when I came back after about 2 or 3 weeks in that site, that was the hospital where the nurse told me, "Eine schwarze Soldat," I wanted to go back to the place where I was from. And in those days, what you did is you wanted to hitch a ride. So I walked out on the street and I waited and waited. When a car came by, I raised my hands to hitch a ride. And so that's why I was on my way to a place called Wiener Neustadt, where, because the year that I was at Ebensee, I learned languages. They asked me to stay with them and to translate, because that was the site where those from beyond the Danube River, either Romania or Hungary or Ukraine or Yugoslavia, were persons that were going back home, had to go through. And if they were those that the persons who were the officers in charge, those that for whatever reason they thought that they were allies of the Nazis, they were sent to Siberia. Those other ways, if for whatever, in one way or the other, they were able to explain that they have not done any wrong, then they let them go home. So from there, I hitched again, got on a train, went back to the village where I was born, but now in the city. And I didn't want to stay there. Again, what I wanted to do is, after I was there, I had family members that I knew that went either to Palestine or to the United States. And I had an uncle in New York, and I wrote him a nice letter asking him if he would sponsor, because I heard that if you want to go to America, you need to have a sponsor. And about 10 days after I wrote my letter, I got a response. And in the response, it said, yeah, I'll be very happy to sponsor you. Well, you could not do that, what was now again Romania, or in Hungary. You had to go to Germany. And I went back to Germany in an area that was controlled by the British military. And for lucky me, there were also Palestine Jewish Brigade soldiers. So I arrived at Bergen-Belsen, and I was there and there and there. And obviously, I went to the consulate representation, and I wanted to ask the representative of the council how, how and when would I be able to come to the United States? And I waited and waited until one day, the commanding officer of that Palestine Jewish Brigade that I associated with, and I assisted those that wanted to go illegally to Palestine, asked me one day, would you want to go to Palestine? Being 15-year-old after liberation, not knowing much about Palestine, but I didn't want to stay there anymore. So I went with them to Palestine. And what you know today about the state of Israel, I arrived there in 1946, and obviously it was the area, part of it were Jewish persons living, part of it were obviously persons, Palestinians that lived there. So I arrived there, and after a while, volunteered. And in my volunteering with caravans that were taking food on the way to Jerusalem, and if one of you gets to be on the road to Jerusalem, the old road, you will see the caravan, some of the vehicles that they destroyed there on the way to Jerusalem. But my life, I managed to be for about a year there. And after that, I volunteered to serve. Again, I lied about my age. When I was almost 17, I told him I was 18 years old, and I volunteered. And in the introduction, you heard that my name was Harel. Well, my name was Hershkovitz at that time. But I volunteered and I served with the major military unit, with the Palmach, with the 6th Battalion of the Palmach, and
the Harel Brigade.
And I fought in the War of Independence, and my major responsibility was to get the road to Jerusalem, because that's where our unit was for the most part. And 1948, the United Nations decided to have a divided responsibility there. Part should be Palestine, part should be the state of Israel. Obviously, to this day, Palestinians did not want to have an independent state there. So we fought, and we brought about the opening of the areas. And I fought mostly on the way to Jerusalem, but I fought with the Harel Brigade. And at one of our reunions, about 50 of us decided that we will change our names. Whatever our name was, we'll change our last name should be Harel. So my last name, Zev Harel, is because I served with the Harel Brigade. And obviously, I could stand here and spend time and time about the warriors, spend time about the establishment of the state of Israel. I was in Israel for a good number of years, for almost 20 years. And what I have done there, I enjoyed very much being a truck driver. And because I was a member of a collective settlement, I worked as a truck driver. But the collective settlement, the kibbutz that I was part of, they wanted for me to be a youth educator. And against my better judgment at that time, they sent me to a teacher seminar, which I spent 2 years learning there. And when I came back, I got to be a youth educator for 4 years. And obviously, I had to do something right with those children that came from the Middle East, from either Egypt, Morocco, Iran, Iraq, and so on, because at one of the events when we were visiting Israel, we met one of the kids who now this is about 20 years after, when he was about 30 some years old, and what he decided to do, he invited us to come to their place of residence. And when you come to someone from the Middle East, whatever they have in the house will be on the table. And he just told us they will take us to a restaurant. So guess what? They took us to a restaurant, and that restaurant, there was a reunion. All the kids that I worked with about 20 years earlier were now at the reunion. It was such a touching experience, such an enjoyable experience. Now, obviously, I will briefly tell you that in Israel, after I attended the teacher seminar, I decided I'm going to get an education. And when I was 30 years old, I studied for and get a high school diploma. So you heard me what much education I had before that, but I managed to get a high school diploma, and then I wanted to get an undergrad degree, and I went on and got an undergrad degree at the Hebrew University. And I worked in those years in youth education at Paranor, Ben Shemna Youth Village, and then got to be director of a youth village at Kfar Galim. And 2 years after being there, one day I get advised that the National Council of Jewish Women brought 4 fellowships for persons with undergrad degrees who would come to the United States and get a graduate degree. Well, you see this partner here next to me. I didn't want to go to New York. I was fortunate to get one of the fellowships because I wouldn't have the money to pay for education, but I got one of the fellowships. I didn't want to go to New York, and I was told there is a community, a smaller community in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the University of Michigan. So I got there. We met 56 years ago, and 1 year later we got married, and we will have this year our 55th anniversary. So I could be here and talk to you, but I want to give you the opportunity for you to ask questions. And I hope that I'll be around for a few more years. So other than Ms. Hartley that has done such a super job in her education that I can brag about, others also do very good education. And when I have a chance, if you'll invite us, I'll be very, very glad when we can drive around to come to your school and meet you again with your students. Well,
there was one question, the name of the city where you lived from 1940, 1940.
Okay. One question that I understand there is, where do I live in Transylvania when we moved from the village, from Borgo, Baia Mare in Romanian, Nagybanya in Hungarian. And now I will wait to hear questions, and I'll be glad if I can to answer them.
Zev, we have one question that is, do you have any brothers or sisters?
Well, what I want to say to you is that I didn't have a chance. I have one brother, and both he and I survived, but my brother, about 30 years ago, he lost his life. And from my age peers, there was one other, all those that were my age or younger, not one of them, one who was a few months older than myself, of my age peers or younger, that came back alive.
Can you also tell us what happened to your parents?
Well, my father, should rest in peace, was with me in the same camp, but he couldn't take it and he lost his life there. And I had several cousins that are with us in that camp that also lost their life there. My mother, bless her memory, she survived, but after a few years after liberation, she passed away. So not too many relatives. We have a few cousins, and if I had a chance, I would share with you about life and living, but I'll let you ask your questions.
Toronto.
If you have questions, just make sure you put them in the chat. Zev, in the meantime, while we're waiting for more questions, can you tell us, you talked about doing work in the ghetto. Can you tell us what kind of work you did?
In the ghetto, before the cattle cars arrived to take us to Auschwitz, they needed to have what was before just a simple building guarded and secured. So I was working, making around the ghetto whatever arrangements they made so that people could not walk out of there. And also like latrines where men had to go one way, women had to go another way in order to do what you have to do, you know, in more normal circumstances, because they didn't have latrines there. So we made, in the ghetto there, we made latrines. And
Okay.
the latrines for men were different than the latrines for women. The only thing that women could do there is go there, and it was like guarded, but like if they see,
Like
they
an
didn't have
outhouse?
what to sit down on, but you know, what you can do without being able to sit down. For men, it's always easier because they had to do their latrine life easier.
Oh, did you say after liberation you were united with the girl that brought you food when you worked in the
Okay,
barn?
the question is, what did I do? Well, what did I do to this woman that was the daughter of the owner of the guest house there, Chris Marian Guest House? Well, I want to just tell you that we had rescue fantasies. And, you know, as we were working while I was there at Ebensee, while we were working there, we had all kind of fantasies. And my fantasy was one day I'll come back here to this guest house, order a meal, and pay for it. You know, we all had rescue fantasies thinking, you know, it's going to be good and we'll survive and so on. Obviously, a few years after liberation, I wanted to go back and visit the site where I was at Ebensee, both to visit the underground tunnel, what it looked like, and also the construction material site across the street. And obviously, I went into that restaurant, Marian Guest House restaurant, and ordered. In those days, Wiener Schnitzel in Austria was very, very enjoyable. So I ordered Wiener Schnitzel, and the daughter, who was now the owner of that restaurant, looked at me and said, "You were here. You worked here, didn't you?" So I told her, yes. So when it came, I asked for the check. And she said, "No, no, 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 we'll treat you." And I said, "No, the first time I'm here, I'm going to pay for it. I'll be again here, and then you can treat me again." So the first time I paid for it. But I also want to tell you, simple life and living. In the village where I was born, across the street from us, was this very poor woman. And when she heard that we were in the ghetto, she didn't have money apparently to come and take the train to the city. She walked about 6 miles, 10 kilometers to the city, brought us a loaf of bread. So I wanted for my partner here, my favorite, she used to be my favorite girlfriend, and she is still my favorite person. I wanted for her to be with me to see where I was born and where I lived. So we visited the village where I was born. And this person that brought the loaf of bread was still alive. So we didn't bring a check for her. What we bring is some dollars, US dollars. And I gave her a nice sum of dollars and thanked her for what she has done when she brought the bread for us in the ghetto. But also what I want you to have a sense for, that the years that I was in the camp, where I was in the camp, among the guards, some were so evil characters because what they would do. And so that you get a sense, the place where I was at, we would get every week about 500, 1,000, 2,000 persons to replace those that lost their lives. But in addition to the natural death and end of life, what the SS guards would do, they would take someone's head and throw it away and say, "Go and get it." And when the person would go to get his head, they would shoot him. Or they would say, "You are so dirty, your body would just not let a bullet get in," and just shoot one person after another. So I learned central tendency. Anywhere we would be marching, I would not be on the sides. I would not be in the front or in the back. I would always be in the middle, central tendency. And I think that added for me not to be one of those that one of the SS guards decided to end life in that way. Anything else?
Yeah, there's some more questions in the chat.
Zev, one of the questions asks about, excuse me, I'm not sure you were at Auschwitz long enough to know this, but a teacher asked if you were aware of any of the experimentation going on at Auschwitz or anywhere else while you were there. Did you hear about medical experiments or anything like that?
Well, for your information, think about your students. I was 14 years old when I was taken to the ghetto first, and then from the ghetto to Auschwitz. So I can't pretend that I knew much of anything other than the places that that I have been. Auschwitz, and then Mauthausen, and then Ebensee. Later on, one of my, in the introduction, you can, and if you're going to type in Dr. Zev Harel, the information about me at Cleveland State University, where I'm Professor Emeritus. I've been there for about 40 years, and I have written a couple of books one about Holocaust survivors in the United States and Israel, another one, Holocaust survivors and their contribution to establishment of the state of Israel, and so on. But in my years of work, what I wanted to have for people a sense is what was like and what people have to say. And I had obviously I had to do what I could in order to do the work that I did at the university in order to become professor and to enjoy my work. And what I decided to do is to do whatever I can in order to make the life of the students as good as possible. And what I want to say, and I want to brag about Ohio, because Ohio in some ways is one of more progressive of the states in this country. And what we managed to do there is, like, if you're going to be going and driving by Cleveland State University, you'll see a tall building called the Rhodes Tower. The reason for it is because Rhodes was the governor at the time when I became associate professor at Cleveland State University, and I joined a unit called college unit. And so what that governor did when he found out that I was a Holocaust survivor, he wanted to have an annual Remembrance Day at the governor's mansion. And I agreed to be there for the first year, but I also asked him to have a veteran. So today, if you ever get to Columbus, Ohio, to the governor's mansion, you will see that there is a memorial site honoring remembrance of Holocaust survivors and World War II veterans. And that governor, with the last name of Rhodes, was such a decent person that I knocked on the door of our president at Cleveland State University to name that tower Rhodes Tower to honor the person who was then governor. So what I want to say to you is that I enjoyed our years at Cleveland State University and wandering around in Ohio to do what we could. Like, I can brag about the fact that at Cleveland State University, first in the School of Social Work and related units, not to have failing grades, to get incomplete grades. And teachers, don't give failing grades to your students, give them incomplete. And so after Cleveland State University, almost all the state universities decided to accept that precedent of not to give failing grades, but incompletes. And, when I think back, two of the students that I really enjoyed, one of them, I gave him an incomplete grade and then got an A grade from me and from others. And one day he said, after he got his master's degree, I want to go to the university where you got your PhD. Would you write a letter of reference? Of course, he was such a good person that to begin with, he would have gotten a failing grade have I not given him an incomplete. And to go on and to be such a successful. The other person that again comes to mind, he was Jewish. And I gave him the compliment that he was the laziest Jewish students that I have met. He ended up being the Dean Bar-Ilan University in Israel. So what I want you to have a sense, teachers, that if you encourage in whatever way you can, your students will rise and will make you proud. And I'll give you a chance to ask your questions, and if I can, I'll try to answer them.
Thank you, Zev. How about we end with this one last question here, and that is, were you able to go back and meet the Black soldier who pulled you out of that ditch and took you to the hospital? Were you able to meet any of the liberators at all from Ebensee?
Was I able to go back
Did you ever find the black soldier that
Oh,
saved
the
you?
question about the black soldier.
And did you ever meet any of the liberators from Ebensee?
Well, two parts of the question. One, the African-American, but the nurse there, eine schwarze Soldat, see, they didn't have name identity. And later on, I got to know, we had John Glenn from Ohio, we had Lou Stokes, who was congressperson. I knocked on their doors to help me find that. I couldn't. But the third, what I did at Cleveland State, because I got to meet a woman with the name of Anna V. Brown, who was the director of social services at the city of Cleveland. And I asked her if she would agree for us to have at Cleveland State an annual event. And she was an African-American. So Anna V. Brown Community Forum was there for about the years when I was there, year after year. And what we tried is to identify needs of African-Americans and find ways of solutions. And so I can feel good that we managed to do that year after year after year. We had speakers, congresspersons, senators, and all kind of in the state or national persons at the Anna V. Brown Community Forum, but also had a unit that we would go and find what are the needs and how is best way to, and you know, today, the mayor of the city of Cleveland is Jackson, who's an African-American. And years ago, Stokes, a mayor, African-American, first mayor in city. So that was number one. Number two,
meeting the liberators.
Meeting the liberators, what I found out that the 3rd Cavalry, how did I find out? Because in Cleveland, we had a larger association of Holocaust survivors called the Coley Israel Foundation, and we had our annual event. And when we had our 50th anniversary of liberation, we invited all the veterans to come there. And one of the veterans that came there said, I was commanding officer of the unit that liberated you, the 3rd Cavalry. So for about 15 years, we attended their reunions, either in Detroit or in Chicago. And it was just a very, very pleasant ability to thank them in person for what they have done in World War II.